How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
What's shaking? My name's Cam, welcome back to another video. Horror has changed in a lot of ways, not just in books, but also in films and television, live performances, fandoms. Like everything should, it has evolved as time has gone on, and sure, an argument could be made that a lot of those changes, a lot of those evolutions, maybe they aren't the best, but today I want to talk about some of the differences, some of the pros and the cons of both classic horror and the newer, gorier fiction that has stepped up to the plate. Now, you can't do that without pointing out the fact that all of the horror we have now we owe to classic horror. Authors like Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, Shirley Jackson, say what you want about him, but H.P. Lovecraft. Those writers and many others all laid the foundation for how suspense, tension, and paranormal or cosmic dread is used in fiction today. Personally, I prefer modern horror, but I feel like that's pretty much to be expected. This is the time period that I was fortunate enough to grow up in. I've been desensitized to most of the stuff that would be considered scary in the classics, and probably partly because I snuck into the living room at 2 a.m. when I was like 8 years old and watched Evil Dead. I'm also convinced that's most of the reason I wet the bed until I was like 10 years old. What I'm not going to be doing is comparing the book covers between classics and modern horror, because I've already done that. I have a big, long video essay on that, which I'll leave a card up here for, or a link below. In that video I talked about how I feel like the book covers have gotten a bit more boring as time has gone on. In this video though, I want to talk about the actual stories on the pages. I want to give you my own personal thoughts on what I think has changed and what I think has stood the test of time. And look, you might disagree with me, and that's completely fine, but you know, don't get your knickers in a twist about it. This here is a pretty impressive collection of horror short stories by a long list of very well-known classic authors. Let's name a few. Charles Dickens, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Thomas Hardy, Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, Robert Louis Stevenson, Bram Stoker, Lucy Taylor, all heavyweights of horror fiction. Anytime I do read classic horror, I notice something that a heavy majority of the stories will have in common. Not all, but most. The scares involved seem a lot more dependent on the psychological impact that the story has on you, the reader, rather than the aftermath of the horror for the characters in the actual story. Edgar Allan Poe is known for having a pretty nihilistic style of writing. I'm sure most of you know about the poem The Raven, Thank You, The Simpsons. And look, I'm hesitant to even mention it because I know it's the go-to classic horror for lit bros to like hyperanalyze, but it is a great example of a self-meditation on death and the afterlife, and it feels like that was the point, rather than it being a thrilling tale intended to scare you. It feels like Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Raven to put his own existential dread into writing, rather than just to scare you. And funnily enough, ironically enough, that's what makes it so chilling. He very simply and honestly tapped into a universally shared fear. Mortal dread. And look, that's all I'll say on The Raven, but I do want to mention another Edgar Allan Poe story in here. A story this time, not a poem, that deals with the topic of death in an equally creepy way. Premature Burial by Edgar Allan Poe is a number of small accounts of people who have been declared dead before they were. The story then leads into some very personal thoughts on a certain character's crippling fear of being buried alive. See, the thing is that they have a condition. They have a condition that puts them into a death-like trance, and they're worried that one day this will happen, people will think that they are dead, and they'll be buried. We have descriptions of characters that were buried alive, sealed into a tomb while they were still alive, waking up in the middle of an autopsy. And then the last part of the story, a small section, describes in grueling detail our main character believing they've woken up and they believe that they have indeed been buried alive. Their worst fear has been confirmed. The reason I mention The Premature Burial is because it's a 9-page story. 9 pages, and it contains almost nothing that you would consider action. That's just not really something that you will see a lot of today. The accounts of people being buried alive sounds creepy when I say that, sure, but in reality they're pretty much just referred to, and the climax of the story, the part that actually makes this a horror, is entirely inside of the character's head. We're not reading about them clawing their way out of a coffin or anything like that. The story is entirely them freaking out internally that their worst fear has been confirmed. If this story was written in 2021, we would have fingernails breaking against wood. We would have blood leaking from slices on the man when he wakes during his autopsy. And I'm not saying that would make the story any better or worse, it's just different. The point I'm making here is that most classic horror I've read feels extremely personal. It feels like authors tapping into their deepest fears and their phobias that are almost universally experienced. There's rarely a central antagonist or like a big spectacular thing that is beyond belief, and even when there is, the story seems to focus a lot more on the atmosphere and the mental turmoil that it creates for the characters rather than any physical harm. Even with stories like Call of Cthulhu from Lovecraft, we have one of the most iconic horror figures of all time, and yet the horror still comes from how incomprehensible this thing is. Not necessarily anything that we actually see Cthulhu do. The terror, the dread, comes from how small we are to that thing, how small we as humans, as a species are to something like that. The potential it has for destruction and the complete lack of power that we have to stop it. The story is very heavily focused on the cult of Cthulhu and how that cult drives the main character into madness, and I would argue that that's long before we even see Cthulhu or have it confirmed that Cthulhu exists. Lovecraft was credited for pioneering the genre or the subgenre cosmic horror, and cosmic horror is quite literally fear of the unknown, fear of something that is far beyond what we could possibly hope to understand as mere humans. And again, that's a pretty universal fear. Look, I can't avoid mentioning that the writing in a lot of classic horror is outdated. It just is. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's also completely fair that most people just won't be able to get past that. Putting aside the fact that we as a society now are desensitized to more slow-paced horror, the language does make it very difficult to get too invested. It is extremely distracting when a few paragraphs about a man waking up and thinking that he's been buried alive is padded with some extremely dense and lengthy strings of words that just aren't used anymore in our language. It doesn't make those classic authors any less good at what they did, but it is worth mentioning when we're talking about horror in today's day and age. I also think there's a bit of a misconception about how most of classic horror's meaning is buried in subtext, or how much of it is raveled up in deep symbolism. It feels a lot more natural to analyze and search for the meaning in classic horror over modern horror, sure. But I also think that a lot of the time, most of the time, a lot more than people think anyway, the authors are pretty on the nose with their themes. Again, just to refer to Edgar Allan Poe, you could sit there stroking your chin and pondering on his work and hyperanalyzing it for hours on end. Sure, but most people on the first read-through are going to know exactly how the story is meant to make them feel, or at the very least, most people are going to know Edgar's fears when he wrote it. So times changed, and so did horror, especially during the age of slasher films in the 70s and 80s, when scaring the audience became a lot easier with the use of disturbing and shocking imagery. It became a lot less about peeking into the author's personal fears and more about the creator delivering more immediate scares. The focus shifted from slow, creeping dread to heart-stopping terror. It was less about thinking about the fears in the back of your head and more about fearing the shadows in the corner of your room. More blood, more monsters, and a lot more violence. Again, not to say that psychologically focused horror didn't exist or that a lot of that more gory horror didn't have a psychological focus, but the trend was shock and awe, and it changed the horror landscape for good. I don't think the change was a bad thing. Like everything else, horror fiction had to evolve. I think between the 80s and now, we've seen horror shift back pretty dramatically towards scares that rely on attacking your expectations and your mental state rather than just, shocking you with blood and guts. But I still don't think I've read any modern horror that feels quite as personal as the classic stuff. I love Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill. It's as slow burn as modern horror can come. But I don't feel like anything in here came from any of Joe's own sleepless nights. I think he had an idea and he was like, oh damn, that would be pretty creepy. I'ma write that down. Which is fine, of course, that's how most stories are written. But it does lack that feeling of shared dread with the author, like maybe The Raven gave us. I prefer modern horror, mostly because the language is a lot more digestible. Again, I just can't get past how distracting the language is in classic horror. Not to say that the classics are unreadable, you can understand what they're saying, but it is distracting. I also enjoy the spectacle of violence and shocking moments that drastically impair the characters, even in psychological horror. As much as I like a horror story sticking with me, I do like being excited when I'm reading it as well. I don't dislike slashers, although I feel they're much better suited for like films and television. I think more often than not, slashers don't translate that well to the page. I've always said that psychological horror is my favorite when it comes to books, and hell, movies and TV as well. The times that I've felt genuinely scared watching or reading something is when it made me question my own fears or morals or intrusive thoughts. The beauty of those stories in today's era is that they're generally approached in much more creative ways, because the authors have no choice. So many stories have already been told, more than at any other point in time. So authors now, more than ever, have to really push the envelope to be interesting and be unique. And that is when we get gems like The Cabin at the End of the World, The Ruins, or I don't know, the entire Goosebumps catalogue. I won't say that modern horror is better than classic horror. Firstly, because I know a bunch of you nerds will hit me with the actually in the comments, but also because I just don't think that's necessarily true. I think a lot of classic horror books could work today still if the language wasn't so outdated. The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson, for one. The thing is that as we moved from classic horror to modern, we got a lot more sub-genres of horror. Stories in the style of these classics still exist. They're still being written. They just have to share the spotlight. I will always be more inclined to pick up a new horror book because I know I won't be distracted by the phrasing and the language, and because it almost always has a higher chance of surprising me with something terrifyingly outlandish. But hey, what about you? I always hate it when people read an old classic and instead of just saying like, oh, I didn't like this, classics aren't for me, the language is too outdated, they have to make a big song and dance about it and be super theatrical and go on and on about how boring and basic this old book is and blah blah blah. Without authors like these breaking the mold and writing stories that for that time were terrifying and new and brave, we wouldn't have any of the modern horror today. Look up interviews with basically any famous horror writer. They almost always say their inspiration was one of these boring classics that you think you're really quirky for hating. I would have loved to have made like an hour-and-a-half long video essay about this because there's so much more that could be said. I could have really dug into the intricacies and all of the differences and all of the stuff that has stayed the same with this type of conversation, but unfortunately I have a full-time job, so this will have to do for now. But again, let me know what you think. What do you prefer? Do you like the new or the old? Thanks for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. I really do appreciate it. See you in the next one. Catch ya.